In this demo, I'm going to be covering F5 IngressLink using NodePort. Last week I recorded F5 IngressLink using cluster IP. So clearly there's a difference between cluster IP and using NodePort. And the difference is really what is BigIP's pool members. When using NodePort, BigIP's pool members are going to be the Kubernetes nodes themselves. When using cluster IP, it's BigIP directly to pod. And in the diagram, you can see that BigIP is able to connect directly to the pods. So in cluster IP, you would see 3 pods as represented by the pod IP addresses within Kubernetes. But when you use cluster IP, the BigIP has to integrate with the Kubernetes CNI. That means the Kubernetes container network or interface has to be connected to the BigIP. So the BigIP in this case, by default, would have a VXLAN tunnel configured. And all data traffic would go across the overlay to the pods directly. So ultimately, BigIP can see the pods. But for any reason, if you didn't want to use a CNI such as Calico or a CNI such as Flannel, which is VXLAN, you can use NodePort. And so in this example, I'm going to be going through what are the differences between the NodePort configuration and how does it look compared to cluster IP. And we'll talk about some of the differences, but there are some clear different configurations that you have to apply to both CIS as well as on the nginx side to make sure that the NodePort integration works. And I'm going to go ahead and demo this as well within this diagram. Let's recap. What is F5 IngressLink? So F5 IngressLink was released at Agility, and it's really the concept of integrating F5 CIS with nginx kick or nginx-ingress controller to simplify the configuration for both or all personas within Kubernetes. So what does that mean? That means that from the Kubernetes perspective, the Kubernetes administrator really only needs to interact with potentially maybe the Kubernetes ingress routing configurations. That's all of the application logic. That's the application configuration that routes the traffic between the coffee and the tea service. And that is configured within the Kubernetes cluster, and the nginx-ingress controller is interacting with the kubadmin and those resources that are created to load balance the traffic between these two pods. CIS, or even BigIP in this case, is not interacting with that application level routing. What's really happening here is that CIS is automating BigIP with the pool members so that BigIP can forward traffic across the Kubernetes network, in this case to the Kubernetes nodes themselves. And the Kubernetes nodes will use kubeproxy to forward the traffic to nginx. So ultimately, when you introduce NodePort, you're actually clustering 3 proxies: BigIP, kubeproxy, nginx-ingress controller. And so you have to ask yourself and be aware of that, and you're connecting using a specific node IP and port. But that's for a different discussion around getting into more details with NodePort. The nice thing about NodePort is simplicity is there. You don't have to worry about any of the tunneling configuration. So that's a little different. What IngressLink is doing is it's simplifying the configuration on CIS to automate BigIP by communicating a little bit more with the nginx-ingress controller. And you'll see that level of integration. It is development that is in both CIS as well as nginx-ingress controller. There's code that has been developed by two development teams that are interacting with each other across a common API. You could call that the IngressLink CRD or Common Resource Definition. And there's going to be more code development. There's going to be more simplification that's to come. This is just the start. So the first thing, let's look at the major difference inside the service. And CIS is doing service discovery. Let's bring up the diagram. CIS is doing service discovery based on its endpoints, and its endpoints in this case is nginx. So CIS needs to look at the nginx deployment as well as the nginx service to determine how the traffic is going to be addressed. And we can see that by going into the service. So let's take a look. All of the files that you need to reproduce this repo or do a proof of concept are in my GitHub repo. So you could just go to my GitHub repo. The link will be in the page as well as this user guide, or in the YouTube. I'll include the link as well in the description so that you can see and just clone the repo. So if you can see right here, we're at NodePort. If you go and look at my Kubernetes cluster, you can see here that I have literally cloned the repo. And so you can do the same thing by simply just cloning. It'll pull the files in. You'll have access to all the files. Then you can just make the changes that you need specifically for your network. So let's take a look first at the configuration within nginx. And the service is what's really important. And the service is going to define how to connect to that pod. It's all defined in the service. And the first thing you need to look at is what is the type. And this service is of type NodePort. So that defines how the traffic is connecting to the pod. What's also important here is what ports are exposed. And as you can see, we are exposing ports 80. We're exposing ports 443 for TLS type traffic. But we're also exposing one additional port. And this is really important. This additional port 8081, that's exposed is the readiness port. And the reason why we're exposing this readiness port in the service is it so that we can connect to this port via NodePort. And that's important. Who would need to connect? BigIP would need to connect to the readiness port for its health monitoring. So we'll come back to this in a second. But again, that is really important that you would need to make sure that that is configured in the service. With IngressLink, you don't need to do much. Just clone this repo, don't change the names, and you'll be able to reproduce this infrastructure, no problem. The other item where there's going to be a difference is when we go back into NodePort and take a look at CIS's deployment file. CIS deployment file will actually specify what type of pool members CIS is going to see. And in this case, you can see here that my pool members is of type NodePort. I am not using any tunnels. Just communicate via NodePort. And so CIS knows, and therefore would tell BigIP we're using NodePort, so you don't have to worry about forward database entries. You don't have to worry about the tunnel information. So that's the two big differences with cluster IP versus NodePort, specifically for IngressLink. So let's go take a look at an example here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to enable the service, and then I'm going to create the resource definition. So we'll go take a look at the service. We saw it earlier. And so I'm going to change to this directory and enable the service. And so let's make sure we go to the correct directory, and that's in the nginx config, kubectl create, that service. And now that service is created. And so what we should see is if we go here, we should be able to see kubectl get pods. So as we can see, we have our coffee and tea pods. These are the application pods. nginx kick is going to distribute traffic to these pods based on their URI. Let's take a look to make sure that nginx is running. kubectl -f. Actually, let's do a kubectl get pod -n, and then we'll do the nginx-ingress. As you can see, we have 3 instances running. How do we have 3 instances? It's based on the replica. So let's take a look at what the replica was. We'll go look at the nginx-ingress configuration. And in this case, oh, interesting, we have 4. And that is because I changed the replica earlier. But if I go ahead and redeploy this manifest, which is what I'll do, just so that we can show you in the demo that we have 3. Let's go to NodePort, nginx config. So I'm going to do a kubectl apply -f, and I'm going to do nginx, and this is the ingress.yaml. And now we can go ahead and do, if we just give it a minute here, it's going to apply that. And let's go ahead and do that again. Let's do a kubectl get pods -n nginx-ingress. As you can see, there are the 4 pods. What I had done in my previous demo, like I said, this is part 2 of the demo, was replica or change the replica. And so we have 4 pods. So my question is, when I deploy the IngressLink resource, will I have 4 pool members or not? Or will I have kubectl get nodes? Or will I have more nodes or more pods? That's a really good question. So let's see what happens with the difference. So the last thing we need to do is we need to create the ingress resource, because currently if I go and look at BigIP, we'll log into BigIP. I'll take a look. So looking at BigIP, changing the tenant IngressLink, there's no configuration on the BigIP. So we need to create, going back to that diagram, we need to create this CRD resource definition. We are manually creating the CRD resource definition, and I am defining the public IP. The public IP is the IP address that's going to be addressed on BigIP. That's going to create the listener that it will allow traffic to be forwarded to the nginx kick pods via the kube proxy using NodePort. And so to do that, let's go to the CIS and CRD resource, and let's take a look at what that resource looks like. So if we go into the directory structure, it's all about the directory structure because this is the source of truth. It's where all the files are. And we take a look at this is the configuration that I'm going to apply. So we've really simplified a lot here. And notice that there's no monitors, but we're going to get monitors. And the reason why is because the monitor is hard-coded to use that port 8081, that readiness port. We're exposing that in the service. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't have to define the monitor, because the monitor is configured and set by default. That's part of IngressLink, simplification. So you'll notice here that I'm specifying the public IP, the external IP. What's coming in future versions of this IngressLink release is the integration of IPAM, where you won't have to specify this address. You can specifically specify a label. That label could be using something like service type load balancer, or it could be an IPAM label. It depends upon how you want to do it. There's other items that are going to come in here as well. We're going to elevate the potentially layer 4 CRD resource up to more of a layer 7 CRD resource, so we can potentially do TLS termination, we can do WAF, etc. But let's go ahead and configure this. So kubectl create -f. You'll notice right away I can see the API request. There is the API request to BigIP. So I'm monitoring the API. I'm monitoring all API traffic between CIS and BigIP. We're using the AS3 based API, and you can see there's the post request and there's the response. So 200 OK, the tenant was updated and updated successful. There will only be an API change if there's a change in Kubernetes, if there's a change in the service, if there's a change in the pod replica, or if there's an additional create or removal of a service or any type, there'll be a change. But other than that, there is no API communication. So if we take a look now at BigIP, you'll notice that there is our traffic for both port 80 and port 443. Let's go ahead and connect to the T service, and then we will continue to refresh that. And let's go ahead and connect to the coffee service. And so that's auto refresh. So you can see the server address is changing here. These are the pod members themselves. That traffic is getting routed or distributed via nginx. And what's really nice here is BigIP is now set. So the nginx administrators can do pretty much whatever they want, and they won't have to communicate necessarily with the BigIP team or change any of the CIS rules to forward traffic from BigIP to nginx. All that back-end east-west routing traffic can be handled now, and application logic can be handled within Kubernetes by the Kubernetes administrator. So let's go take a look back at that one question. And that one question really is around the pool members. And so because we're using NodePort, let's go back to our diagram. So because we're using NodePort, are we going to have 4 pool members, or are we going to have 5 pool members? Remember, when we use NodePort, we forward traffic to the nodes. And so if we go to the BigIP and take a look at the nodes, we will notice that we have 5. If we look at the pool member, we will notice we also have 5. So that's really important. What is something else that we need to do here? We need to set up some labels. We need to set up some forwarding labels for NodePort so that we don't send traffic necessarily to the master, right? The master, in this case, my master is working as a master node, but in some of your environments, you might not forward traffic to the master or multiple masters. So in this case, we can use a NodePort label. That's another video that I will create. So one thing I wanted to also take a look at is the health monitor. So here is the pool members. So let's go look at the health monitor. You will notice that the health monitor is enabled by default. If we select that health monitor, or if we look at the monitor, we can actually see that we are monitoring the nginx ready page on port number. There is the port you see, because it is NodePort. So it's exposed here, but within the service it's exposed, and that's what's forwarded to the kick piece. So it's really important that we configure that, and then that's what's handled up front. And this is all pre-configured by BigIP, pre-configured by CIS, pushing traffic to BigIP, or pushing the API traffic to BigIP. And so that's what you kind of see between the difference, and that's one of the reasons why it's NodePort. Back to the virtual, and if you want, we can break this out to a network map, and we can see the both for both port 80 and port 443, and you can also see application traffic is going You'll also notice that we're using the real IP, which is coming from the BigIP, and that's one of the reasons why we inject the proxy protocol. So let's go ahead and recap. So this demo was demonstrating the F5 IngressLink better together solution using NodePort. And so this is a follow-up to the cluster IP presentation, where when I was using cluster IP, I was connecting to the pod directly, BigIP to pod, over VXLAN. But since I'm using NodePort, I'm connecting via kubeproxy. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please let me know.